Right, friends, we are back and we are officially in the last lesson, our elaborate, as you can see in the subheading above, for the second 5E sequence out of 4 for the marathon runner. So we're just about halfway through. And as you can see here, this is an elaborate. And elaborate just basically means we're going to really hammer home what we needed to know using like other examples and analyzing some graphs and charts here, just to really understand how some of these phenomena work. In this case, glucose regulation. Okay? That means that because we're doing an elaborate, that means that next is your evaluate, AKA your performance task. And this performance task is going to be done solo. You will be able to use your notes for it though. So make sure that your notes are something easy, clear, and concise that you can understand within some time, because your performance task is going to count as essentially like a mini quiz. All right. So that's going to be super duper important for you. All right. So let's look at our elaborate. So our aim says, how does the body store energy? Let's take a look at our do now question. I'll just go ahead and zoom in. It says the graph below shows changes in concentrations of glucose and insulin in the blood of a human over a period of time, right? And based on the lab that we did prior to this, we saw that insulin, or we learned that insulin lowers blood glucose levels. Now, you might be asking yourself, why does he highlight and annotate so much? Repetition is key, at least for me, and I think that it would definitely be one of those test-taking strategies or one of those methods to understanding your own notes, and just repeating things that you see that are coming up like often. Okay, and you just want to like make sure that you're hammering home. So anytime that I'm doing my own notes, I annotate a lot, and I annotate things that I know could be coming up again, and insulin will be coming up again. Okay. All right, let's take a look at the graph. So it says, which statement correctly explains these changes, right? So on the graph, the solid line we see is glucose and the dotted line is insulin. And we see that when glucose goes up, the amount of insulin goes up. When glucose goes down, the amount of insulin goes down. So which statement correctly explains these changes? Well, the best answer choice here is actually 1. High glucose levels cause more insulin to be released, right? If I have high glucose levels here, I'll mark it in red. I can also see that my insulin levels, I'll mark it in blue here, are also up. Same thing over here. Higher glucose levels yields higher insulin levels, right? And consequently, when glucose levels are lower, insulin levels are lower. So 1 is the best answer choice here. All right. Now, number 2, let's zoom into number 2. It says the fight or flight response in humans prepares the body to fight off or run away from a potential threat. This response results from a series of nerve and chemical signals that direct how cells function. This, in turn, determines the actions of organs in these situations. Some of the changes experienced by the individuals as part of this response include an increased pulse rate. Anytime that I see something like this, I'm gonna wanna annotate, right? Because I know that I'm gonna have to write and explain for myself, and I wanna be as clear and concise as I possibly can when I need to do so, right? So if I'm talking about an increased pulse rate, I know that the body system that I'm talking about here is the circulatory system, right? Because an increase in pulse rate means that there's a higher frequency of blood flow. And if I'm talking about blood, then I'm talking about the circulatory system. Increased blood glucose levels, right? So if I'm talking about increased blood glucose levels, just like our previous explained, we were talking about what body system deals with increased blood glucose levels or those type of things. We can either make it a digestive function, so it could be digestive. But if I know that I'm going to talk about insulin, then it could also be endocrine, because insulin is a hormone. But digestive, if I'm talking about glucose, I know that I get glucose from eating. So if I'm eating food, that's a digestive function. And then increased breathing rate. When I'm talking about breathing rate, I am talking about the respiratory system. Okay? And then it says, once the threat has passed, another series of changes returns the body to its original state. Why must this occur? Right? So essentially what this is talking about is when we're talking about fight or flight response, this is our body's way of survival mode, right? We usually have two options in an emergency situation. We can either stay and fight if we feel like we can overcome the threat, or we can flee, right? We can take flight, not literally take flight with our wings, but we can literally prepare to run away from the threat or the potential threat as far as possible, as fast as possible to get away from it, right? But once the threat has passed, we need a way of bringing back our levels from essentially superhuman back to human level, all right, to its original state. And why must this occur? Well, if we think about it, right, this must occur so the body can reduce the amount of energy used during the threat and return to homeostasis, right? Which is maintaining a stable internal environment. We never ever want anything to be out of balance. And homeostasis and these different mechanisms are going to make sure that that doesn't happen for us. Okay. And if you want to add anything to this, or if you want to take away anything that we wrote here together, that's perfectly okay. Just as long as you understand that this is a question that deals with homeostasis. We want everything to be at a regular set point, just like our blood glucose levels, just like the amount of CO2 that we produce, just like the amount of oxygen we have. We want everything to be nice and balanced so we can live a nice, fruitful, healthy existence. All right, part A. Blood glucose and exercise. A man decided to run track. Oh, excuse me. I'll start that over. A man decided to track his blood glucose levels over time while cycling. He began his ride a little after 12 p.m. and warmed up by cycling at a slow pace. He slowly increased his pace, or sorry, his speed, and then continued his ride at a moderate to fast pace until he stopped at about 4:45 p.m. He did not eat and only drank water during his ride. Okay? What are some inferences you can draw from his blood glucose and cycling graph shown to the right? Right? So we need to draw some inferences. So we need to make essentially like a guess, a think from our see, think, wonder based on what it is that we're seeing, right? So what I'm seeing is that most of his glucose stores or storages were used between 2 p.m. to 4 p.m., right? So from about 2 p.m. to 4 p.m., which is about here, to about there, I literally can see that this is where the majority of his glucose is being used in order to maintain that moderate to fast pace, right? But then, of course, if he stopped at 4:45, then we are going to start to see a steady decrease from 4 to 4:45. What I also see, I'll use a different color, that he had the most energy, or well, not what I see, but what I can infer is that he had the most energy from 2 p.m. to 4 p.m. Why am I inferring that he had the most energy during that time? Because his glucose level was the highest in his blood. More glucose equals more respiration, and more respiration equals more ATP, right? It's pretty simple. The more glucose I have, the more energy I can make. Okay. All right, we are off to an excellent start. Now, part B, storage molecules. Let's read. During cellular respiration, organisms break down glucose to release energy, right, in the form of ATP. Different types of molecules can be broken down into glucose by the digestive system, which is used to generate ATP. The structure of molecules can be represented using letters for different atoms and lines as bonds between these atoms. There's a little bit of chemistry in here for you. We're going to answer the following questions based on the energy molecules below. All right. So glucose, right? I'm looking at glucose, and anytime that I'm talking about a sugar, you're gonna see that the sugar is always in the form of a ring. R-I-N-G, a ring. And in this case, it's a hexagon. Anytime that I see like this hexagonal shape, I know that I'm talking about a sugar. And what I also want to point out to you is that anytime a word ends in OSE, it's a sugar, especially of a more simpler sugar. Not always simple, but OSE. So glucose, galactose, which we'll talk about in unit 3. Sucrose, which is table sugar that you have like at home. Maltose, that's the sugar that they use to sweeten Malta. Dextrose, all of those things are sugars, all right? And I'm gonna just make some annotations from what I see here. I can see here that this glucose molecule is simple, right? It's in the form of a hexagon, pretty simple. It's small. And because it's simple and small, it can easily enter cells, right? So it can easily go into our cells to be used in cellular respiration. This is why glucose is the primary nutrient used in cellular respiration. My body doesn't have to break it down anymore for it to enter cells. It already comes as small as it's going to get in order to enter cells. So my body just loves glucose so much, right? It's small, it's simple, and can easily enter cells to be used in respiration. Now, if we take a look at glucose's cousin, if you will, we see glycogen. And we spoke briefly about glycogen, or we briefly mentioned it as stored glucose, right? This is how glucose is stored in the body. Is stored in the body as glycogen, right? And when it's stored in the body, what you'll notice is that it's kind of like linked all together. All of like those small glucose molecules are all going to get linked together and be stored away at a later date, right? Almost kind of like a pantry or a cupboard in your kitchen. It stores away some of that food that you are not eating or not using, all the way up until you need it again, then you can go in and you can start using those ingredients. So that's all glycogen actually is, right? And in comparison to glucose, we can see that glycogen is more complex in structure, right? Especially since those glucose are all attached. It's large, especially comparatively speaking to the glucose. But because it's complex and large, they can't easily enter cells. It must be digested, broken down to enter cells, right? So if you take a look here, I'll actually show you where those bonds are being broken, right? If you see here, right, that's being broken there, and this is being broken here. And you can see that it literally looks identical to the glucose. That's because each one of those hexagons that we're seeing here in the glycogen is one glucose molecule. But you can see that they look like they're all holding hands, right? That's because they're all linked together, all right? So it has to be broken down. Those bonds have to be broken so that way we can break down that large complex glycogen into small glucose molecules so they can be small enough to enter our cells. Okay, pretty simple. We have glucose that's already ready. Glycogen needs to get ready. And then we also have triglycerides, AKA fats. All right. And if I'm looking at this, just at a quick glance, I can literally see here that fats are very complex, right? I just see these letters like everywhere. It looks longer, it looks bigger as compared to glucose and glycogen, right? And fats also have a lot of stored energy, right? Our body uses glucose and glycogen and sugars, carbohydrates in general first. Whenever we need energy, it's gonna burn up all of the sugar that we have. And then if we run out of sugar, we're gonna burn off the fat. That's why it's so important that in order for us to burn fat, if we want to like maintain our weight or even lose some weight or stuff, we limit the amount of glucose or the amount of sugar, carbohydrates that we eat, right? That's why a lot of people, when they're trying to lose weight, they avoid high carb foods such as pastas and rice and potatoes. They try to avoid that as much as they can so that way their body has no choice but to use their fat as an energy source, all right? And because this is so large and complex, just like glycogen is, it must be broken down, right, or digested to be used for energy, right? But what's special about fats, like we already said, is that it's only used if glucose or glycogen has been depleted. So if the body already used up, oh, I used up all the glucose, I used up all the glycogen. Now what am I gonna burn? I'm gonna burn fat, right? And it's great to burn fat, but not too much because fat also serves very special functions that your body needs in order to maintain homeostasis. So you don't wanna just go around burning up all of the fat that you have in your body. That's not great either, okay? So that's basically what all of this is essentially showing us here, right? Glucose is very simple. Glycogen is slightly more complex than glucose, and then fats are extremely complex, okay? Now, number one, we're gonna quiz ourselves. Which energy molecule is the smallest, right? So out of these three, glucose, glycogen, and triglycerides or fats, which is the smallest? We should know by now glucose. It's the only one that we said did not have to be broken down. They already are easily able to enter the cells, which brings us to number two. Which energy molecule is readily usable by our cells? Again, that would be glucose. That's why our body just loves glucose so much because it's ready, willing, and able to be used for energy. Three, which energy molecules must be broken down in order to be used by our cells? All right, so it says circle one, but we're gonna circle as many that apply. Because there's actually two, glycogen and fats, right? We know that they're really large and they're very complex, therefore they have to be broken down so that they're small enough to enter our cells and be used as a source of energy. Now, number four says, why do you think it is important for large molecules from the food we eat to be digested, broken down into small and simple molecules, much like glucose is? And we know that so they can be small enough to enter our cells and be used to generate ATP energy. And number 5 says, which human body system is responsible for breaking down large food molecules into smaller food molecules? First of all, I'm talking about food and I'm talking about breaking down. There's only one body system that deals with that, and that is the digestive system. Digestion literally means to break down into smaller pieces. That's what the word digestion means. All right. And there's actually 2 ways in which we typically break down our foods, right? We have mechanical digestion, which is physical. And we have chemical digestion, which is acids and enzymes, right? So mechanical digestion might include, right, like our stomach churning, physically churning up the food that we have, using our muscular stomach to literally churn up that food and essentially turn it into mush. And when we eat, right, we have to chew our food. We literally have to chew our food and break it down physically so that way it's small enough for us to swallow it and get to our stomach in order to be further mechanically digested, but also chemically digested, right? We have saliva, which contains enzymes that specifically break down carbohydrates into simpler sugars. We have acids in our stomach. We have, bile in our small intestine. We have so many different mechanical and chemical ways of digesting our food so that way they eventually become small enough to enter our bloodstream, to be carried to our cells so that our cells can take them in and be used in cellular respiration. Okay? And then 6A says, which human body system is responsible for transporting, first of all, if I'm talking about transport, oxygen and nutrients, such as glucose around the body, there's only one body system that transports anything. And the only thing that gets transported around the body in mass is blood, and blood only belongs to one body system, and that is the circulatory system. If you look at the word circulatory, we see the word circulate. We're circulating blood. Simple, right? Now, what type of cell in the body is responsible for transporting oxygen and glucose to our body's cells and transporting waste products, such as carbon dioxide and water from our body cells, right? And we have a prompt here, red blood cell, right? RBCs, red blood cells. In the case that our body needs to store away excess sugar for future use, where do you think our body will store away sugar? Explain your reasoning, right? So where is a good place that our body would store away any excess sugars that we need in the future? It has to be somewhere that's readily available for us. Readily available for us. And it has to be somewhere where our body can easily access it so that way we can use it conveniently for cellular respiration when we need to do like some type of movement or high energy movement in dangerous situations such as a fight or flight response. What's controlling our movement? Our muscles, right? So we have glucose that is stored in our muscles, right? Because it's a convenient place for us to generate energy in the form of ATP, okay? And just a small reading to kind of wrap up. This is where does the fat go? This is where your fat actually goes when you lose weight. So let's talk about weight loss. Weight loss happens when you burn more calories for energy than you take in. But after you shed them, what exactly happens to all of those extra pounds of fat? Seems like everyone wants to trim the fat, which is why it's nice to know you can lose fat in a single day. And when you do slim down, it might seem like fat has evaporated into thin air, and well, it kind of has. Your body's primary source of energy is glucose, which is stored as glycogen in 2 places, the liver and the muscles. We just spoke about that. Explains Tanya Zuckerbrot, an NYC-based registered dietitian. When your body uses up its glycogen stores, it turns to fat for fuel. So that's what we spoke about earlier. Once we used up all of our glycogen and used up all of our glucose, now we got to start turning to fat for fuel. All right? Fat is stored in our body as triglycerides, which is made up of atoms. When we start shedding pounds, these atoms form into carbon dioxide and water, right? So if we take a look here, right, we have H for hydrogen, O for oxygen, and C for carbon. These letters or these atoms are going to get rearranged when we start using and burning this fat. It's going to get rearranged into carbon dioxide and water, which is a lot easier for us to let go of simply by exhaling, right? Physicists Reuben Meerman and Professor Andrew Brown from the University of New South Wales published their research on where does the fat go? Sorry, brain fart. Where does the fat go? In the British Medical Journal in 2014. Through their novel calculations, they concluded our lungs are the primary excretory organ for weight loss. Ooh. Meaning, when you lose weight, you breathe out most of the broken down fat as carbon dioxide and lose a small percentage of water as sweat, urine, and tears. Isn't that so interesting? That's so interesting, right? But now we encountered a new vocabulary word, excretory, right? And when we're talking about excretory, we're talking about excretion, which means the removal of metabolic wastes, right, from the body. And when we talk about metabolic waste, we're really talking about carbon dioxide, water, urine, sweat, just byproducts of respiration that our body is constantly trying to get rid of, salt, things like that. Not feces, right? Not doo-doo, none of that. That's not metabolic waste. That's digestive waste. That's undigested waste, which is a little different, okay? And I want you guys to think here, how can we increase the rate at which we burn fat and excrete carbon dioxide and water? What are some ways in which we can increase the rate of burning fat in our body? Now let's continue reading. Maria Bella, a nutrition expert, adds that exercise, an activity that increases our breathing or breaths per minute, therefore aids in weight loss. It's important to remember, however, that diet remains the most important factor for weight loss, something made clear in the British Medical Journal study. Take, for example, a relatively sedentary 150-pound person who sleeps for 8 hours, rests for 8 hours, and is active for 8 hours. This person will exhale about 1.5 pounds of CO2 per day. If this person was to replace an hour of rest with an hour of jogging, this would only raise this number by 1/3 of a pound per day. And to lose 2 pounds of fat, that person would need to exhale about 6 pounds of CO2. In other words, it's hard to work off a bad diet. Okay? And we have another vocabulary word that we want to introduce here, which is sedentary. Right? And sedentary just basically means not physically active. Now, let's finish up. According to Zuckerbrot, the best route to maximize fat loss is to follow a high fiber, lower carb diet. By following a high fiber, low net carb diet, you give your body the carbohydrates needed for energy without going overboard on carbohydrates, which is eating an excess of that leads to weight gain, right? So fiber, I know that you guys have heard of fiber before. Fiber is excellent, right? Because fiber is an undigestible complex sugar. Ah, I bet you guys didn't know that, right? But the function of fiber in our diet is to help keep bowel movements very regular. Okay? It's to help keep bowel movements very regular. That's why your doctor will always encourage you to eat your vegetables because vegetables are very high in fiber. Okay? So, if you want to lose fat, lower your carb intake. Carbohydrates, by the way, are sugars, right? Sugars and complex starches that we find in potatoes and stuff. Lower that. So that way, if you lower that, then you force your body into burning off fat, right? And the only way that we can increase the amount of fat that we burn is to exercise, right? Because the demand for energy is a lot higher. Your body is going to be forced to burn off more fat in order to fuel itself with respiration to make more energy in the form of ATP so you can continuously exercise without stopping, all right? You guys are super duper duper awesome. And before we actually go, I'm going to briefly just go over how, sorry about that, how insulin works. Okay. Sorry, bear with me. All right. So I drew this lovely depiction, which I'll also give you guys your own copy as well, of how insulin works, right? At the cellular level. All right. All right. So again, insulin functions by decreasing blood glucose levels when they are too high. Right? So if I look here, I have an insulin molecule, or sorry, a glucose molecule. Inside of a body cell, right? Most likely a muscle cell. Let's say it is a muscle cell. Okay? And this is our glucose molecule. And look, we have a legend down here. So you can look at the legend down here to see. All right? On the surface, we have these insulin receptors that have a very particular shape. And the purpose of the insulin receptor is to receive the molecule of insulin, right? That's produced by the pancreas. Notice that they have shapes that fit very, very well and very comfortably. So whatever is going to fit into that receptor has to fit like a puzzle piece, okay? If we take a look on that same cell, not only do we have receptors, but we also have glucose channels. And a channel is anything that lets a signal pass through, right? So this glucose channel is specifically there to let glucose in to the muscle cell so that the mitochondria can use it to generate energy in the form of ATP within the muscle cell from the blood, okay? But it is closed because the only way to open this glucose channel is for insulin to bind to the insulin receptor, much like a lock and key. If insulin is the key, then the receptor is the lock. And once they bind to each other, that's what's going to prompt the glucose channel to open. So if you look here, right, insulin is binding to the receptor. All right, this is my receptor, my insulin. Right, they're actually interacting with each other. And as a result, that glucose channel is going to open up. And once it opens up, glucose from the blood, right, they're going to enter the muscle cell. right? And the mitochondria inside of the muscle cell is going to use up all of that glucose to make energy in the form of ATP. That's it. That is it, guys. That's how insulin works. That is how insulin works. All right. And you'll also get your own copy of this. And you can also use this explanation as well for your performance task. You guys are absolutely amazing. Remember, your performance task is coming up next. So make sure that you have all of your notes, everything that you'll need, so that way you can maximize the amount of points that you need. All right. Our next 5E sequence is going to be thermal regulation, and there is a state mandated lab called Balancing Act. That's going to be really important. And there will be another performance task at the end of thermal regulation. So we're almost halfway through unit 1. All right. I know that this is a lot, but we totally got this. You guys are absolutely awesome. And I'll see you next time. Bye.